Thank you, Mr. President. For those of us sitting in the circle, I think all of us would agree that we live in the greatest country in the history of mankind, known to mankind today, for a lot of different reasons. Not because we're wealthy, not because we're powerful, but because of what we do with the goodness that's been created as a result of over 300 years of hard work and good ethics in this country. We've had an international situation here which sort of makes me a little more sentimental and perhaps a little more likely to think on a higher altitude about our country and our history. And how did we get here? We're the most altruistic, selfless country that's ever been on the face of the earth. We have an incredible ethic when it comes to helping those in need. We have an incredible sense of duty when it comes to creating world order that creates stability for other countries, for the little guy, the little woman throughout the rest of the world that may not be so fortunate to live in circumstances like we do today. And I think we all have to ask ourselves, how did we get here? We got here because we had a very strong, fundamental founding document that lined up the self-interests of each of us as individuals with the collective interests of the whole. And that led to a system of commerce, a system of capitalism, some people like to call it, but it's a system that has worked. It's been proven over 250, 300 years now in this country to bring out the good in people. And boy, have we become an incredible nation in so many different ways. When you introduce the whole concept of regulation, of government that overextends itself into the lives of individuals, especially when we're talking about commerce, and especially when we're talking about taxes, we know that we are putting sugar into the fuel tank and we're slowing things down. We're not doing everything we possibly could to be maximizing the potential of each individual, each collective organization, whether it's a partnership, a corporation, or whatever it might be. At the end of the day, these are entities that create employment, that allow people to find employment, that allow people to find an identity every day when they wake up and have a sense of meaning, and not to mention the other virtuous benefits that come along with that, such as an income, so that they can take care of their family and their children and future generations if they're in a position to do so. So the point of all that is, if we are raising our taxes too much, we are putting the brakes on, and we are harming the future people, not only in our state, but in our country, by reducing the potential to raise revenues. If we have government that grows too big too quickly at the national level, or more specifically here in the state of Connecticut, we have to catch up with that through the function of the Finance Committee, raising revenues. And I think that that is something we have to pay very, very close attention to, because we all do know that there is a point of diminishing returns at which taxpayers either say they can't afford it or they don't want to afford it, and they can move to another part of the country. With a budget that's growing over the long term, over 30 years now, at close to 7%. We've slowed that rate of growth down in this terrible time of economic crisis. But at close to 7% for nearly 30 years, mathematically, you can't keep up with that. We know that for a fact because our base, our economic base, and our tax base is not growing at a healthy enough rate to do so. So an end game that does not include a firm map to get to fiscal stability for the state of Connecticut is one that is sure to cause our demise. And there's a lot to be worried about here. There are some things to be hopeful about here. I'm just concerned that we may be making some wrong choices with this budget before us today. We know that other states around us, Mr. President, New York has shown wisdom, great wisdom, I think, in doing what they've done. And some people say, sure, they're just pushing it down to municipalities. But if you take a couple of layers off the onion, you see that they're doing that with a great deal of thought behind it. They're not just shifting the burden down to municipalities. They're going to make it easier for them. New Jersey, I think, got it right. And yes, you can point to a couple of towns there that are going to have undue burdens put on their shoulders that they will have to figure out. But for the vast majority of municipalities and towns, they're going to be fine, because the state government, the executive branch, will find a way to help them. Massachusetts is even taking a step in the right direction, I believe, by becoming smart about what you can do and what you can't do in today's world and in the future of the world. There are a few things at the national level and international level that cause me to be very worried, and I think that states should be paying very close attention to that as well as they deal with their fiscal issues. New Hampshire, almost a neighbor of ours. They don't have an income tax. They have a balanced budget. They have an incredible lifestyle up there. They have an incredible approach to governing their citizens. Yes, it's a small state and it's a little more remote, but they do get it when it comes to taxation. So with the backdrop of all of these other states around us in New England and also the Northeast who are showing, I think, greater responsibility to us here in Connecticut, I do have a question through you, Mr. President, to Senator Harp.
Please frame your question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Harp, I know you've been hard at work, and I applaud you for that. I used to sit on your committee. I know how much work it is, and my hat is off to you for doing yeoman's work to get to where we are today. But one thing I never really fully understood, even after sitting on the committee, was the whole idea of current services. And for the benefit of the people of Connecticut, anybody who's watching CTN this evening, and for my own edification, can you explain how current services works? Because if I have my numbers correct, it looked like current services was going to be 9.5% more expensive in 2012 as compared to 2011 fiscal year before the Appropriations Committee got their hands on it.
Senator Harp.
Thank you. Through you. I will attempt to explain it. Basically, current services means the amount of dollars that it would take to maintain services as they are in 11, taking into consideration the statutes that would require increases in various line items. So, for example, ECS has a statutory requirement for an increase. We're not increasing that, and there are a number of others that have that as well. So if you would have current services, that would mean it would be today's costs escalated by the law that we currently have in the books that may actually require us to spend more.
Fair enough. Through you, Mr. President, thank you for that description. I'm still having a real tough time with the concept because I suppose I'm more of a private sector person than I am a public service person. I know we're not really supposed to look at state government as running a business, but at the end of the day, running a business well and having accountability is the exact same thing that should apply, I think, to public service for all of us. And I was really surprised when I saw that number. I believe it was 9.4%. When at a time we know inflation is somewhere in the 2.5% to 3% range, how in 1 year's time those current services requirements could have gone up, by that much, unless there was something unusual or awkward about the counting from the previous year before that, if there was some sort of a makeup. So I'm very curious about that. And I can tell you, in the private sector where there seems to be more accountability and more flexibility in the interest of being successful in the long term, we will look at our revenue generation capabilities, and we know that in the case of an economic downturn, those prospects aren't nearly as good as they would ordinarily be, so we adjust accordingly. And we cut back. If we need to reduce the number of people who run a company, we'll do so. If we need to cut our R&D budget, if we need to cut our marketing and advertising budget, we'll do so. In government, I know it's different, but at the same time, you do have to match revenues with expenses. And therefore, I think taking the current services approach is a dangerous one if that's the sole way we're doing it. I know the Appropriations Committee has done yeoman's work to try to bring that rate of growth down to a much more reasonable level. I believe it's in the 2.5% range, and I applaud you for that. But still, at the same time, I don't think we've gone far enough in terms of reducing those expenses. We know that we are the high-cost supplier of services and goods to the people of Connecticut in many, many cases. I think we could become much more efficient. And in the meantime, in the worst set of fiscal and economic circumstances we've seen, I'm just wondering, could we have not made a greater effort to cut back a lot more so that we would, almost by definition, create a much greater potential for success in the future? If we didn't have to raise taxes as much, wouldn't every business that's teetering right now be able to survive? Wouldn't every business that's really suffering but still in a position to survive the next couple of years do that much better, hire that many more people, and get into a virtuous cycle so that we have more people on payrolls and more people paying revenues to the state of Connecticut, not just payroll taxes, but hopefully all kinds of other taxes, sales and use taxes, and maybe even some investment income taxes and capital gains taxes as well. I think that's really where we need to be. So it's a little discouraging for me. In fact, it's very discouraging for me because we're not out of this recession. We're still at over 9% unemployment. I think people are very nervous. Employers are scared to hire people. They don't know what the structural costs are going to be going forward. If you give them a certain level of confidence that there will be some continuity going forward and that costs will be reasonable, including tax costs, I think you give them much greater incentive to start hiring again. Through you, Mr. President, I do have a question to Senator Daley, the co-chair of the Finance Committee.
Please proceed with your question.
Thank you. Madam Co-Chair, Senator, you've done an incredible amount of work as well, and I need to ask you this question. Is the hospital tax, in fact, back in the budget bill?
Senator Daley?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President, and through you, Mr. President, to Senator Frantz. Yes, it is.
Senator Frantz.
They don't want you asking me questions.
Senator Frantz.
Duct tape works pretty well, too. Through you, Mr. President, Senator Daley, it's going through a final iteration. I believe it's number 6. Do you know if it's going to change substantially from iteration number 5?
I do not.
Fair enough. Thank you. If it is relatively the same as it was the last go-around, this is one of the taxes that I'm particularly very concerned about. We'll talk about this later, hopefully. But this is a great example of how, when you get into a desperate situation at the state level and you need to get everything you possibly can, and there are programs available at the federal level where if you make a structural change or if you spend some of your own state funds, you will get a portion of that or some additional incremental funding from the federal government, usually a small percentage or maybe 30, 35% at the most, to add to that program or potentially to put into your general fund. And I believe we're picking up an additional $150 million in revenue from the federal government as a result of implementing the hospital tax, which I believe is a 4.5% tax on patient service billings or revenue. And there are winners and there are losers as a result of this. And I'm just curious if that's still as bad as it was before, because I represent a district that has a wonderful hospital in it that has worked for nearly 90 years to become one of the preeminent healthcare institutions in not just New England but the country in some specialized areas. Is it as bad as it was the last time around?
Senator Daley?
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and through you. I think we all know the outstanding reputation of Greenwich Hospital, and I would hope that's what the new iterations are all about, making sure that the effect is not as great as it was in the last iteration.
Senator Frantz.
Thank you. And through you, Mr. President, I also share that hope, and there may be some more on that later. Also, through you, Mr. President, for Senator Daley, the concern I have is in generating these revenue estimate consensus, whatever the word is. We know we had a couple of good months, and I'm just curious. And I suppose this is what makes me worried, is if we're not using a sizable data set to extrapolate what's going to happen to revenues in the future, because we're still in very much uncertain times right now, are we taking a risk that the revenue consensus is not an accurate one because the data sample was too small? And my question through you, Mr. President, to you, Senator Daley, is do you feel confident yourself that we have enough data to make the assumption that these revenue estimates are reasonable?
Senator Daley.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and through you, Mr. President. Yes, I do have confidence that they are reasonable. They are, after all, estimates, and just estimates. Every year when we adopt revenue estimates, there is some risk. But I feel quite confident in the formula that's used by OFA and the data that reach that they're able to achieve.
Senator Frantz.
Thank you, through you, Mr. President. I appreciate that answer. I think the senator is absolutely right. It is a bit of a guessing game, and you have to go with what you have in order to somewhat accurately predict what we're going to be looking like on the revenue end of the equation going forward. And we are in a little bit of a vacuum still these days because we have not experienced a recovery in earnest in any way that you look at it, whether it's the employment rate or whether you're looking at the state output rate or gross domestic product rate or any economic metric for that matter. So I do worry about that, and I'm not sure that there's much we can do about it right now, but that is of great concern. I am concerned because at the national level, and we're not immune from it, even though we're a smaller state, we're not immune from the national economic woes. There's typically an 18-month to a 24-month lag between when the nation recovers and Connecticut recovers, and that's of great concern also because every day that goes by that people are not working, especially when unemployment benefits are running out, is not good for the state collectively speaking. It's not good for our revenue picture. With that, Mr. President, I really feel that Connecticut should have made an honest attempt for the benefit of the citizens of Connecticut, for the benefit of the future generations of Connecticut, who will rely on us making wise and prudent decisions today as their fiduciaries going forward. We can't overspend. We can't overtax, because when we overtax, we take away from that potential I was talking about in the very beginning of our state being able to continue being a great state from an economic and a commerce point of view. We have been absolutely top of the heap, lead in the entire country in so many different industries and internationally as well, and we're slipping away from that model, and we should not be slipping away from it. We should be revering those days and understanding what about state government, what about the business environment, what about the economic climate in Connecticut was it that allowed us to be so prosperous and so great back when we had unemployment to the tune of 1.5% to 2%, which is the structural rate. It's actually lower than the structural rate nationally. Our great days could, in fact, be over. They might not be if we make all the right decisions today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator.